The padlock cost $14.75. It was a master lock model 6835 hardened boron alloy designed to resist bolt cutters and hacksaws. The kind of lock you'd use on a storage unit or a tool shed. The kind of lock that said, "What's behind this door no longer belongs to you." David Monroe had purchased it that morning from the hardware store in town, along with a steel hasp and a battery-powered drill. He was 32 years old, compact and precise in his movements, and he wore the pale blue polo shirt of a United States Department of Agriculture field inspector. His shoes were polished. His clipboard was organized. He believed with the kind of certainty that comes from graduate education and regulatory authority that he was doing important work. It was April of 2011, a Tuesday. The sky over Greene County, Tennessee was the hard, clean blue that comes after 3 days of rain. The air smelled of wet grass and diesel fuel from the tractor idling near the barn. Silas Blackwood stood 15 feet away, his arms crossed, watching Monroe drill into the cypress door of the butcher shop his grandfather had built in 1901. The drill whined, wood dust fell in pale curls onto the concrete step. The sound echoed off the whitewashed clapboard walls. Silas was 68 years old. He had worked this land for 54 years since he was tall enough to carry a feed bucket without falling over. His hands were thick and scarred, the knuckles enlarged from decades of physical work. He wore canvas work pants and a faded denim shirt with pearl snaps. His face was weathered the color of saddle leather, and his eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky. He did not speak as Monroe installed the hasp. He did not plead or argue. He had already said everything there was to say. Behind him, his son Jacob was not so restrained. "This is insane." Jacob's voice cracked with frustration. He was 31, lean and restless, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt he'd ironed that morning. "We showed you the plans. We have the loan approval. We're fixing everything you asked for." Monroe straightened up, setting the drill down carefully. He looked at Jacob with the patience of a man who has had this conversation before. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, addressing Silas, not Jacob, "I gave you 6 months to show compliance. Temporary measures while you built the new facility. You addressed none of the 27 violations. The wooden cutting block is still there. The knives with the porous handles, the uncoated walls. None of it. It's the same way my grandfather did it," Silas said quietly, "and his father before him." "Sir, your grandfather didn't have to worry about multi-state outbreaks of antibiotic-resistant bacteria." Monroe's voice was firm, but not unkind. "We have systems now to prevent that. The law isn't optional. The law doesn't know the difference between this place and the 10,000 hog-a-day factory in Iowa," Silas said. "That's exactly the point," Monroe replied. "The law doesn't have to. The pathogens are the same. The rules are the same. It's the only way to guarantee safety." Silas looked at the young man. He saw no malice there. He saw certainty. He saw a different kind of knowledge one learned in classrooms at Cornell University, not in barns. A knowledge of systems, of data points, of risk probabilities. Monroe carried his regulations the way a priest carried scripture. He was a believer. The hasp was installed. Monroe took out the padlock. It was still in its plastic packaging, the price sticker visible. He tore it open, aligned the shackle, and pushed it home. The click was small but absolute. The sound of a business ending. "Dad," Jacob's voice was tight. "Say something, do something." But Silas just stood there watching. His jaw was set, his eyes steady. He had made his choice 6 months ago, and he would live with it. Jacob stared at his father for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to his truck, a newer model Ford with payments he was still making. He climbed in, started the engine, and spun his tires in the gravel as he accelerated down the long driveway toward the county road. Monroe gathered his tools. He offered Silas a final nod, climbed into his government-issue sedan, and drove away. The only witnesses to what remained were the dozen Berkshire hogs in the nearby pen, who watched the proceedings with mild, intelligent curiosity before returning to their rooting. Silas stood there for an hour. The farm around him was 284 acres of rolling pasture and hardwood stands in the western part of Greene County. The deed had been signed in 1888 by his great-grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, who had bought the land for $1,900 in gold coin after 2 years of logging his own timber to raise the sum. Thomas had built the main house from that timber, yellow pine, and white oak with his own hands and those of his 3 sons. He had built the spring house from fieldstone cleared from what would become the North Pasture. And in 1901, he had built the butcher shop where Silas had worked for 3 decades. The butcher shop was a simple clapboard building 20 feet by 30 with a concrete floor sloped toward a central drain. Inside was a massive oak cutting block worn into a gentle saddle shape by a century of use. There was a walk-in cooler that Silas's father had installed in 1962 and a collection of knives that Thomas Blackwood had forged himself from old saw blades. Silas still used those knives. He sharpened them every Sunday evening on a whetstone his father had brought back from a trip to Arkansas in 1954. The stone's surface was smooth as silk. For 30 years, Silas had processed his own hogs and those of his neighbors. He raised Berkshires, a heritage breed known for rich marbled meat. He charged a fair price, $1.25 per pound hanging weight. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady. The business grossed about $40,000 a year. After expenses, the electricity for the cooler, the wrapping paper, the insurance, it netted him about $5,000. That $5,000 paid the property taxes and kept a local tradition alive. Now it was gone. Silas finally turned away from the locked door. He walked slowly back to the main house, his boots crunching on the gravel. Inside the kitchen was silent. Jacob had not come back. The table was still covered with the spreadsheets his son had prepared, projections and loan amortization schedules, all rendered meaningless now. Silas sat down heavily in the chair where he had sat for breakfast every morning for 68 years. He felt the weight of his age. He felt the weight of failure. He had let his grandfather down. He had alienated his son. The government, with its good intentions and its clipboards, had come to his home and declared his life's work unsafe, unclean, unlawful. He had fought the only way he knew how, by refusing to fight, by saying no. But saying no felt in that moment like surrender. The trouble had started not with a complaint, but with a form. A new federal regulation, part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, required all meat processing facilities, no matter how small, to be federally inspected if they sold meat across county lines. Silas occasionally did when a friend from a neighboring county brought him a hog. The law had existed before, but enforcement in rural areas had been lax. Now it was not. David Monroe had arrived for the first time in October of 2010, a Tuesday morning, much like this one. Silas had been in the middle of breaking down a 250-pound hog when Monroe walked in, clipboard in hand, disposable blue booties over his polished shoes. For 3 hours, Monroe had measured, photographed, and documented. He measured the lumens of the light fixtures. He took temperature readings of the walk-in cooler. He ran a gloved finger along a hairline crack in the concrete floor. Then he had asked Silas for his HACCP plan. "My what?" Silas had said. "Hazard analysis and critical control points," Monroe explained. "A written plan identifying every potential point of contamination in your process from receiving the live animal to the final sale, with documented procedures for mitigating each risk." Silas had gestured around the small clean room. "I wash my hands. I wash my tools. I keep the meat cold. My plan is in my head. I've been doing this for 40 years. Never had a problem." Monroe had made a note on his clipboard. He pointed to the oak cutting block. "Porous surface. Can't be sanitized. Regulations require non-porous food-grade polyethylene or stainless steel." "That block's been here 110 years, Silas said. "It's soaked so deep with salt, it's preserved itself." Monroe made another note. He pointed to the wooden handles on the knives. "Porous surface." He pointed to the painted, clapboard walls. Not smooth, not easily cleanable. The floor drain wasn't up to code. The junction between the floor and wall wasn't coved for proper sanitation. By the end of the inspection, Monroe had identified 27 distinct violations of federal code. He had not been unkind about it. He laid out the path to compliance clearly. Silas would need to replace the cutting block that knives the lighting. He would need to resurface the walls with epoxy-coated panels. He would need to pour a new COVID floor and install a new drainage system. He would need to hire a consultant to draft an 87-page HACCP plan. He would need to keep meticulous daily records of temperatures, cleaning procedures, and supplier information. The estimated cost, Monroe said, pulling a brochure from his briefcase for a company that specialized in small plant construction, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. Jacob had seen opportunity. He had seen a loan, a new facility, a chance to modernize and expand. He saw a brand Blackwood Heritage Meats. He spent weeks putting together a business plan, getting quotes, talking to a loan officer at the bank in town. "We can do this, Dad," he had said one evening, spreading his spreadsheets across this very table. "We can increase our volume by 500%. We can get into restaurants in Knoxville and Nashville. This isn't a problem, it's a catalyst." Silas had looked at the numbers. The debt figure, $250,000 at 6.8% interest. Monthly payments of $2,872 for 10 years. That was more than the butcher shop had ever netted in a year. He looked at the projected revenue. Jacob had pulled the numbers from industry reports. They were optimistic. They assumed a market that didn't exist yet. They assumed Silas could process 5 times the animals without losing the quality, the touch that was the only reason people came to him in the first place. He looked at his son, his face full of excitement and belief in a future made of stainless steel and government approvals. Then he looked out the window at the old butcher house. "The debt is the trap," he said quietly. "We take their money, we have to play by their rules. All of them. We become a small version of the big guys and we'll get crushed." "But we don't have a choice." Jacob's voice was tight with frustration. "It's this or it's nothing. Monroe's coming back in 6 months. We have to show progress." Silas had been silent for a long time. Finally, he picked up one of the spreadsheets. "This paper says we'll make more money," he said. "But it doesn't say what it will cost, not the dollars, the other things." For the next 6 months, the argument simmered. Jacob pushed. Silas resisted. Jacob saw his father as stubborn, afraid of change. Silas saw his son as naive, seduced by a logic that had put thousands of small farmers out of business. The bank provisionally approved the loan contingent on USDA approval of the building plans. Jacob hired an architect. The drawing showed a gleaming metal building, a perfect sterile box that would sit where the old vegetable garden used to be. The old butcher house would be torn down. When Monroe returned in April, Jacob had proudly unrolled the architectural drawings on the hood of his truck. Monroe had looked them over and nodded. "This is a good start," he said. "A very good start." Then he turned to Silas. "So what have you done in the existing facility to move toward temporary compliance?" "Nothing," Silas said. And that was when Monroe had gone to his car for the drill, the hasp, and the $14.75 padlock. Now sitting alone in his kitchen, Silas felt the full crushing weight of 68 years. He felt old. He felt beaten. He did not eat dinner. Jacob did not come home. As the sun set, Silas sat in the growing darkness staring at nothing. Around midnight, he stood up. He pulled on his work boots, stepped out into the cool spring night, and began to walk. He did not walk toward the padlocked butcher shop. His feet carried him up the gentle slope behind the barn toward a small stone building he had not thought about in years, the spring house. It sat 100 yards from the main house, built into a north-facing slope, 12 feet by 16 feet, constructed from the same filled stone Thomas Blackwood had cleared from the pasture. The door was heavy oak, swollen with decades of moisture. Silas had to put his shoulder into it. It gave way with a groan. The air that hit him was cool and alive. It smelled of wet stone, of deep earth, of clean water. He stepped inside. His eyes adjusted to the darkness. He could hear the gentle, constant sound of water moving through the stone channel that his great-grandfather had carved more than a century ago. The spring emerged from the hillside at a steady flow, cold and clear. Silas knelt and put his hand into the water. It was shockingly cold. 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, pulled from deep within the hill. For 70 years, this had been where the Blackwoods kept their milk, their butter, their eggs. The thick stone walls kept the interior cool and humid, a perfect natural refrigerator. Then in 1958, the Rural Electrification Administration had run a power line down their gravel road. Silas's grandfather had bought a Frigidaire refrigerator for $319.95. The spring house had become a place for storing old jars and broken tools. Its purpose had been superseded by technology. Silas stood in the darkness, breathing the cool, mineral-scented air. And then a memory surfaced. He was 6 years old, maybe 7. His grandfather was standing in this very spot holding a ham. A big country ham caked in salt and black pepper. He was hanging it from an iron hook set into one of the overhead oak beams. This is the secret boy his grandfather had set, his voice a low rumble that Silas could still hear across 6 decades. Not the salt, not the smoke. It's the time and the cold. The slow, steady cold. It lets the salt do its work without the meat going bad. It's a race. The salt has to win. Here, the salt always wins. Silas looked up. The iron hooks were still there. A dozen of them hammered into the beams a century ago, dark with rust. He had forgotten. He had completely forgotten. Before the butcher shop became a business, selling fresh cuts of pork before his grandfather had built it in 1901, the Blackwood family had been known for one thing above all else: their salt-cured country hams. It was a slower process, a more patient art. It required no electricity, no stainless steel, no daily logs, no HACCP plans. It required only 3 things: good pork, good salt, and a place like this. A place with constant, deep, natural cold. Silas stood there in the dark, the cool air on his face, and for the first time since David Monroe had arrived with his clipboard 6 months ago, he felt something that was not despair. It was the germ of an idea. A quiet, stubborn, deeply rooted idea. The next morning, Silas did not try to call Jacob. He did not look at the padlocked butcher house. He took a wheelbarrow, a shovel, and a stiff bristled brush, and he went back to the spring house. He spent the entire day cleaning it out. 50 years of accumulated debris came out in loads. Old mason jars, some still sealed, the contents unidentifiable. A broken axle from a Model T Ford. A rusted crosscut saw. Newspapers from 1963, the pages brittle and mouse-chewed. A child's wooden wagon with 3 wheels. He shoveled. He scraped. He scrubbed the stone walls until his shoulders ached and his hands were raw. The work was hard, but it felt purposeful in a way nothing had felt for 6 months. By evening, the spring house was clean. The water channel ran clear. The stone walls showed their true color for the first time in decades, a beautiful gray and tan layered sediment. Jacob came home at dusk. He saw the pile of refuse outside the spring house, saw his father emerging with the wheelbarrow. "What are you doing?" His voice was flat, exhausted. "Cleaning," Silas said. "What for?" "Going to store more junk in it." Silas straightened up, set down the wheelbarrow, and looked at his son directly. "I'm going into the ham business." Jacob stared at him. For a moment, he seemed too stunned to speak. "The ham business," he finally said. "Dad, nobody wants those salt bombs anymore. People want lean pork chops, tenderloin. They read blogs about healthy eating." Silas picked up the wheelbarrow handles again. "Some people still know what good food tastes like." "It's a dead business, Dad. It's even more of a relic than the butcher shop was." "Maybe," Silas said, "but it's a business the USDA doesn't care about." Jacob's face changed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Silas said slowly, "that the law Monroe follows all those regulations they apply to commercial slaughter and processing of fresh meat for sale. But salt curing, that's different. That's preservation, like canning vegetables from your garden. He saw understanding beginning to dawn in his son's eyes. As long as I'm not slaughtering animals myself for commercial sale, as long as the curing follows certain guidelines, I can sell the hams direct to consumers from the farm. No federal inspection required. It's a grandfather clause. Been in the books since before the USDA existed. You're serious, Jacob said. I can't run the butcher shop anymore, Silas said, but I can still raise my own hogs. I can take them to a state-inspected facility for slaughter. Bring the fresh hams back here. What I do with them after that in that spring house is my own business. Jacob shook his head slowly. This is crazy. You're talking about starting over from scratch at 68. I'm talking about remembering something we forgot. I want no part of this, Jacob said. His voice was cold. I'm done watching you destroy everything. He went into the house. Within a week, he had taken a job in town at a logistics company tracking shipments on computer screens. He lived in the house but kept to himself. The silence between them was heavy and constant. Silas worked alone. In the fall of 2011, he raised 20 Berkshire hogs. When they reached weight, he transported them to a small state-inspected abattoir 30 miles away. It cost him $75 per animal. He brought back 40 fresh hams, each weighing about 22 pounds. He bought 800 pounds of Morton salt, 50 pounds of coarse black pepper, and 20 pounds of red pepper flakes. In the spring house, he laid the hams on wooden shelves he had built. He mixed the salt and peppers according to his grandfather's recipe proportions he had not thought about in 60 years, but which came back to his hands as if they had never left. He dredged each ham in the mixture, packing it into every crevice, rubbing it deep into the meat. The salt burned the small cuts on his fingers. For 6 weeks, he let them cure, turning them every few days. Then he washed them under cold water, coated them thoroughly in black pepper to keep the pests away, and slipped each one into a cloth sack. His wife had sewn those sacks 40 years ago before she died. He had found them in a trunk in the attic, still clean, still strong. He hung the hams from the old iron hooks, and then he waited. The art of a country ham is the art of patience. It is controlled decomposition. The salt draws out the water, making the meat inhospitable to bacteria. The enzymes within the meat break down proteins into amino acids, creating complex flavors, savory, nutty, sweet. This process takes time, at least a year. The best hams, his grandfather always said, take 2. Silas decided he would wait 18 months. But waiting, he discovered, was harder than he had anticipated. The first challenge came in November, just 4 months into the cure. Silas noticed an unusual smell when he entered the spring house one morning. Not the clean, salty smell he expected, but something darker, more organic. He examined the hams carefully. 3 of them, hanging near the door, had developed patches of black mold. Not the harmless blue-green bloom he expected, but something that looked wrong. He spent the evening in his grandfather's old notebooks, pages yellowed and fragile, looking for answers. He found a passage about ventilation, about the importance of air circulation. The spring house door had warped over the years, creating gaps that let in too much outside air, causing temperature fluctuations. He spent 3 days sealing every crack and gap using oakum and tar, old-fashioned materials that would let the structure breathe while maintaining consistency. He had to throw away the 3 affected hams. It was a painful lesson, but a necessary one. The money was bleeding out faster than he had anticipated. Without the butcher shop income, he was living off savings that were meant to last years, not months. By January of 2012, he had to make a decision he never thought he would face. He sold timber, 20 acres of hardwood on the back section of the property. Trees his great-grandfather had left standing, old-growth oak and hickory that had been there long before the Blackwoods arrived. The logging company paid him $18,000. It felt like selling a piece of his soul, but it bought him time. Jacob watched from a distance. His anger had cooled into something else, something that looked like resignation. One evening in February, he came home with a newspaper listing. "Dad," he said, laying it on the kitchen table, "there's a developer buying land, building a subdivision a few miles down the road. They're paying good money." Silas looked at the paper. He looked at his son. "You could retire comfortably," Jacob said quietly. "Travel, do whatever you want." "I'm doing what I want," Silas said. "You're going broke doing it." "Maybe." Silas folded the newspaper and handed it back. "But you don't sell your bones." Jacob left the paper on the table anyway. It sat there for a week before Silas finally threw it away. Then came July. The heat wave hit Tennessee like a hammer. 12 straight days above 100 degrees. The grass turned brown. The creek that ran through the north pasture slowed to a trickle, and the spring began to fail. Silas noticed it on the fourth day of the heat. The constant sound of water flowing through the stone channel was quieter. By the sixth day was barely a whisper. He went into the spring house and put his hand in the water. The temperature had risen, 56 degrees, then 58, approaching 60. At 60 degrees, the cure would fail. The salt wouldn't win the race. The meat would rot, and 18 months of work, 18 months of hope would be lost. He examined the spring. Decades of sediment had accumulated in the channel. The water was finding easier paths around the stone structure instead of through it. To fix it, he would have to dig deeper, break through the sediment, and reach the true source of the spring. It would mean digging through layered stone and hard-packed clay. For a man of 69 with a back that ached every morning and hands gnarled with arthritis, it was not a reasonable task. He started anyway. He worked in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, and in the evening when the sun dropped below the ridge. He used a pickaxe, a pry bar, a post hole digger. The work was brutal. His back screamed, his hands blistered and bled. By the third day, he had gone down 18 inches. It wasn't enough. By the fourth day, he could barely lift his arms above his shoulders. On the fifth day, Marcus Flynn showed up. Marcus was 73, a widower who ran the antique store in town. He and Silas had known each other since they were boys, had gone to the same one-room schoolhouse, had learned to hunt in the same woods. Marcus had served in Vietnam, come back with a Purple Heart and a limp from shrapnel in his hip that never quite healed. He stood at the edge of the hole Silas was digging and didn't say anything for a long moment. "You're going to kill yourself," he said finally. "Probably," Silas said, not stopping his work. Marcus looked at the spring house, at the hams hanging inside it, his friend covered in mud and sweat. Then he walked to his truck, got his own shovel, and climbed down into the hole. They worked together without speaking much. That was the way of men who had known each other for 7 decades. Words were often unnecessary. Marcus's hip hurt, and every thrust of the shovel sent pain shooting up his leg, but he kept at it. Silas's back was on fire, but he didn't stop either. They went down another foot, then another. The clay gave way to fractured limestone, and beneath that they hit it. The true soil. Cold water, shockingly cold, welling up from deep within the earth. Silas redirected the flow, carving a new channel through the stone. By the end of that day, they had restored it. Cold water poured through once more. Within 6 hours, the temperature in the spring house dropped back to 52 degrees. The hams were safe. That night, they sat on the porch of the spring house, too exhausted to move drinking water from a jug Silas had brought out. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked finally. His voice was quiet, genuinely curious. Silas thought about it for a long time. "Because it's mine," he said. "Not the government's, not the bank's, mine." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood that language. He had fought in a war for reasons he still didn't fully understand, had come home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with him. He had spent his whole life trying to hold on to things that were his own. "You need help with anything else," Marcus said. "You call me." Silas nodded. "I will." Through the rest of 2012 and into the spring of 2013, Silas checked the hams regularly. The scent of the spring house changed gradually from the sharp smell of salt to something deeper, more complex. The hams lost weight as the water evaporated their surfaces, developing the powdery bloom of beneficial molds, blue-green and white signs of proper aging. He marked the days on a calendar in the kitchen. 495 days, 500, 500, 25, 18 months. In May of 2013, on a morning that felt no different from any other, Silas decided it was time. He walked to the spring house and took down one of the hams. It was hard and dense, much smaller than when he had hung it, having lost nearly 40% of its weight. The surface was covered with the harmless mold. He carried it to the house like a man carrying something sacred. Jacob was in the kitchen drinking coffee, getting ready for work. He wore a tie, now cheap polyester, the uniform of his office job. He watched with skeptical eyes as Silas brought the ham inside. Silas said nothing. He scrubbed the ham clean under cold water, washing away the mold. He placed it on the old oak cutting block, the one David Monroe had declared a biohazard, which Silas had moved into the house after the shutdown. He selected one of his grandfather's knives. The blade was honed to a razor edge. He sliced through the hard outer layer, and the resistance told him everything he needed to know. The cure was good. The meat inside was a deep, translucent ruby red, streaked with creamy white fat that had the faint shimmer of pearls. The aroma that rose from it filled the kitchen instantly. It was powerful and complex, nothing like the simple smell of fresh pork. It was the smell of transformation of time made tangible. Silas shaved off several paper-thin slices. He heated a cast-iron skillet on the stove until it was smoking hot. He dropped the slices in. They sizzled and crisped in seconds, the fat rendering clear and pure, the edges curling into dark lace. The smell intensified, filling every corner of the room. He slid the pieces onto a plate and pushed it toward Jacob. Jacob hesitated. He had not supported this. He had watched his father pour money into what he considered a foolish, stubborn dream. He had watched him nearly kill himself, digging in the dirt. He had said more than once that this was all a waste. But the smell was undeniable. Slowly, Jacob picked up a piece of the crisp, dark meat and put it in his mouth. His expression changed immediately. The skepticism vanished. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly, and Silas watched as something shifted in his son's face. Wonder. Pure, simple wonder. "Dad," Jacob said quietly, his voice almost reverent, that's really good." The taste was a revelation. It was intensely savory, the salt perfectly balanced, but there was also sweetness, a deep complexity that built and evolved with each chew. It was nutty. It had hints of caramel. It had a richness that seemed impossible from something as simple as pork and salt. It was nothing like the bland, water-injected pork chops from the supermarket. Nothing like the commercial country hams Jacob remembered from childhood, harsh and one-dimensional. This was different. This was profound. It was the taste of the place itself, the taste of the pasture where the Berkshires had spent their days rooting in clover. The taste of the cool, dark earth of the spring house, the mineral-rich water that had flowed there for centuries. The taste of time, patient and transformative. Jacob ate 3 more slices. He was silent for a long time, chewing slowly, thoughtfully. Then he said, "How many do you have?" 37, Silas said. 3 went bad during the heat wave. "How much do you think you could get for one?" Silas shrugged. "Don't know, haven't thought about it yet." But Jacob had. Silas could see the wheels turning in his son's mind, the same mind that had put together business plans and spreadsheets. "Let me help," Jacob said. Silas looked at his son. "You have a job." "I mean on the weekends. Let me help you figure out how to sell these." It was the first peace offering in 2 years. Silas nodded slowly. That first year, Silas didn't have a marketing plan. He didn't have a website or a social media presence. He had a folding table and his cast-iron skillet. On a Saturday morning in June, he set up at the farmer's market in town. It was held in the parking lot of the Methodist church, a dozen vendors selling vegetables, honey soap, baked goods. He put up a hand-painted sign on a piece of plywood, blackwood hams, aged 18 months. He brought his propane burn and skillet. He sliced the ham paper thin and cooked pieces to order, selling them for $1 a piece. At first, people were hesitant. Country ham had a reputation. Most people remembered it as aggressively salty tough, more of a flavoring agent than something you'd eat on its own. But the smell drew them in. The rich, complex aroma of the ham crisping in the hot skillet was impossible to ignore, and the taste convinced them. An older woman, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in Greene County her entire life, tried a piece and closed her eyes. "Oh, my Lord," she said, "this tastes like my grandmother's. I haven't had ham like this in 40 years. A younger couple newcomers to the area tried it and looked surprised. "I thought I didn't like country ham," the woman said, "but this is incredible." By noon, Silas had sold out of sample slices and had taken orders for 10 whole hams. He charged $12 a pound. A 14-pound aged ham sold for $168. People didn't blink at the price. They understood they were buying something rare. That first day at the market, Silas cleared over $1,700 in orders. Jacob helped him fill those first orders, learning to slice the hams properly, to package them, to handle the money. They worked together in a way they hadn't since Jacob was a boy. Word of mouth is slow but powerful. It moves at the speed of trust, which is the only speed that matters for something genuine. The people who bought those first hams told their friends. They served them at gatherings, and people asked where they came from. Mrs. Patterson brought a ham to her church potluck, and by the end of that Sunday, Silas had 4 new orders. In late June, a chef named Thomas Weatherby was visiting his parents in Greene County. He stopped by the farmer's market and tried a sample. Thomas ran a farm-to-table restaurant in Knoxville called The Foundry, and he was always looking for local products with authentic stories. He bought 2 hams on the spot. The next week, he called Silas and ordered 10 more. He put it on his menu as an appetizer: Silas Blackwood's 18-month Berkshire Country ham, served with stone-ground grits, peach preserves, and a biscuit. 3 paper-thin slices for $18. It became the most talked-about dish in Knoxville. Food writers came, bloggers came. The restaurant couldn't keep it in stock. In 2013, from that first batch of 37 hams, Silas grossed $26,880. His costs were minimal. The slaughter fees $1,500, the salt and spices $400, his own labor uncounted. The timber he'd sold had covered his living expenses for the year. Net profit nearly $25,000. That was 5 times what the butcher shop had ever cleared in its best year. Jacob saw the numbers. He saw the demand. But more importantly, he saw something else. He saw the respect in the eyes of the people who bought the hams. He saw his father not as a stubborn old man stuck in the past, but as someone who had found a way to survive by going deeper into what he knew. Silas had not fought the system. He had simply made himself irrelevant to it. But success brought its own challenges, and the first real test came in the spring of 2014. A large producer in Virginia, a company called Heritage Valley Provisions, began advertising artisan country hams through regional distributors. Their hams were 30% cheaper than Silas's. They used industrial curing chambers with precisely controlled temperature and humidity. They pumped the hams with a solution before curing to speed the process. They could produce 10,000 hams a year. By April, Silas had lost 4 of his restaurant accounts. Even Thomas at the Foundry called apologetic, explaining that his costs were up and he needed to find savings somewhere. Jacob was worried. "Dad, we need to lower our prices. We're getting undercut." But Silas was calm. "We're not competing with them." "How can you say that? They're selling the same product." "They're not," Silas said simply. He didn't lower his prices. Instead, he did something else. He wrote 20 handwritten letters to the customers who had switched to the cheaper hams. The letters were simple. He thanked them for their past business. He included a small sample of his ham vacuum sealed with instructions for how to prepare it. And he wrote, "I hope you'll try a comparison." He didn't argue about his methods or disparage the competition. He let the product speak. Over the next 6 weeks, 18 of the 20 customers came back. One letter came from Thomas Weatherby. It said simply, "I made a mistake. There is no comparison. You're back on the menu and you're staying there." The lesson was clear. Genuine quality needs no defense. It defends itself. But the real transformation in the business came when Jacob made a decision. In the winter of 2013, he walked into the house one evening and found Silas at the kitchen table writing out invoices by hand. "Dad, I quit my job today." Silas looked up. "Why?" "Because I want to do this full time with you." Silas studied his son's face. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Jacob had learned something in those 2 years of watching from a distance. He had learned that his father's resistance to the loan, to the expansion, to the whole system Monroe represented, had not been fear of change. It had been wisdom. The trap was debt. The trap was scale. The trap was trying to be something you weren't. "I want to learn," Jacob said. "Teach me how to cure them. Teach me everything." The next morning, they walked to the spring house together. Silas showed Jacob how to select the best hams, how to feel the quality of the meat. He showed him the exact proportions of the salt mixture, the way to pack it into the crevices, the rhythm of turning the hams during the cure. "It's not exact," Silas said. "You have to feel it. Every ham is different. Every year is different. You have to pay attention." Jacob, who had spent years thinking in terms of spreadsheets and projections, found himself learning a different kind of mathematics. The mathematics of his hands, of his senses, of patience. Over the next 5 years, the business grew, but it grew slowly, organically at the pace Silas set. They never took out a loan. They never advertised beyond word of mouth in the simple website Jacob built on a Sunday afternoon. Jacob handled the logistics. He figured out how to ship the hams safely, how to maintain the cold chain. He set up an online ordering system that was simple and straightforward. They raised their prices as demand grew. In 2015, they went to $15 a pound. In 2016, $20. They started aging some hams for 2 full years, and those sold to the highest-end restaurants for $30 a pound. Every year, they sold out before the next batch was ready. By 2017, they were processing 200 hogs annually, producing 400 hams. Their gross revenue was just over $120,000. Their overhead remained minimal, less than $10,000 a year. The profit margin was extraordinary, but more importantly, the work felt right. It felt sustainable. It felt honest. The padlocked butcher shop stood empty, weathering slowly. Silas never removed the padlock. It had become part of the landscape, a monument to something he couldn't quite articulate, but understood deeply. Then in June of 2017, something unexpected happened. A black Escalade pulled into the gravel driveway, incongruous among the farm trucks and tractors. A man in his 40s stepped out wearing an expensive suit that looked wrong in the Tennessee heat. He introduced himself as Richard Kessler, Vice President of Specialty Acquisitions for Food Corp, a national distributor that supplied high-end grocery chains across the country. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, shaking Silas's hand with the firm grip of someone who had practiced it. "I've been eating your ham for 6 months. It's extraordinary. Best I've ever had." "Thank you," Silas said. "I want to talk to you about an opportunity." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where every other business conversation in Silas's life had taken place. Kessler spread out glossy presentation folders, contracts, financial projections. "We want to buy your business," Kessler said. "Not the land, the intellectual property. The recipe, the brand, the production methods. We'll build a facility in Kentucky with precisely controlled curing chambers. We can produce 10,000 hams a year, get them into Whole Foods, into specialty stores from coast to coast." He slid a paper across the table. At the top was a number, $500,000. Jacob, who was standing in the doorway, felt his breath catch. $500,000. It was more money than either of them had ever imagined seeing. "You'd be retained as a consultant," Kessler continued. "We'd fly you to the facility quarterly, pay you $50,000 a year for 5 years to ensure we're maintaining your standards. The Blackwood name would be on every package. We'd scale this thing properly, give it the reach it deserves. Silas looked at the number. He looked at the contracts. He looked at Jacob, whose face showed the war happening inside him. Then he looked out the window at the spring house. Mr. Kessler, Silas said slowly, I appreciate the offer, I do, but you're not understanding what this is. I'm offering you $500,000 for a recipe and a brand name, Kessler said, confused. You're offering to buy something that can't be sold, Silas said. You can buy my recipe. You can use my name. But you can't buy that spring. He pointed out the window. You can't buy this soil. You can't buy 130 years of my family working this land. You can't bottle a place. Kessler smiled professionally. Mr. Blackwood, with respect, we absolutely can replicate your conditions. Temperature-controlled rooms, precise humidity monitoring, exact salt ratios. We have food scientists who can reverse engineer every variable. It won't be the same, Iwa said gently. Won't taste the same. I think you're underestimating modern food science. Maybe, but this still isn't for sale. Jacob started to speak, but Silas raised his hand. I know what you're thinking, he said to his son. That's a lot of money. That's security. That's everything we thought we wanted. He looked back at Kessler. But what we have here isn't a business that makes hams. It's a place that makes a particular kind of ham because of what it is. You take that away, move it somewhere else, control it with machines, and it becomes something different. Maybe good, maybe even very good, but not this. Kessler tried for another 20 minutes adjusting his offer, explaining the benefits. But Silas was immovable, and eventually the executive gathered his folders and left. After the Escalade disappeared down the driveway, Jacob sat heavily at the table. That was $500,000, Dad. I know. We could have retired, both of us. We could have, Silas agreed, but we'd have sold the thing that makes this worth doing. Jacob was silent for a long time. Then slowly he nodded. He understood. It had taken him years, but he finally understood what his father had been trying to protect. It wasn't just a business. It wasn't even just a tradition. It was a relationship with a specific place, a way of knowing the world that couldn't be replicated in a controlled facility in Kentucky. That evening, Marcus Flynn stopped by, as he often did. When Jacob told him about the offer and Silas's refusal, Marcus laughed. Your father didn't save a business, Marcus said, opening a beer. He saved a way of being. There's a difference. A business can be bought and sold, shelled up and shipped out. A way of being can only be lived. He raised his beer, to living it right. They drank together as the sun set over the pasture where the Berkshires rooted in the long grass. By the spring of 2018, the business had settled into a rhythm that felt eternal, as if it had always been this way and always would be. They had regulars now. Mrs. Patterson ordered 2 hams every November for Christmas gifts. Thomas Weatherby's restaurant had a waiting list for tables because of the ham appetizer. A food writer from New York had written a feature in a national magazine calling Silas's ham the platonic ideal of American charcuterie. Orders came from across the country, but they never expanded beyond what the spring house could hold, beyond what 2 people could reasonably manage. They could have grown. They chose not to. One afternoon in October of 2018, a Ford sedan pulled into the driveway. Silas was at the barn repairing a section of fence. He saw the car and recognized it immediately. Government plates. David Monroe stepped out. He looked older, gray at the temples now. The polo shirt was the same, but it had different insignia. He was a regional supervisor, now Silas learned later. He had moved up in the world of federal inspection. Mr. Blackwood, Monroe said, walking over. I was in the area for another inspection and saw your place. Thought I'd stop by. See how you're doing. Fine, Silas said. His voice was neutral, neither warm nor cold. I heard you're doing something with cured meats now. Country hams. Jacob came out of the house. He saw Monroe and walked over, standing next to his father. There was no animosity in his posture, just a quiet confidence. Monroe looked around. He saw the healthy Berkshires in the pasture, their black coats gleaming in the autumn sun. He saw the well-maintained fences, the freshly painted barn. He saw the obvious signs of a prosperous, well-run operation. "So, what exactly are you doing?" Monroe asked. "The butcher shop is still closed, I see." "We're in the ham business," Jacob said. Monroe looked puzzled. "Country hams, I thought that market was pretty much dead. Can't compete with modern production methods." "It's a small market," Jacob said calmly, "but it's a good one for us." Monroe's professional instinct kicked in. "You're selling them commercially. You must have a processing facility. I'd need to see your paperwork, your HACCP plan, your temperature logs, your sanitation protocols." "We don't have those," Silas said quietly. Monroe frowned. "What do you mean you don't have those? How can you operate a commercial food business without federal inspection?" "We don't need it," Jacob said. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone stating a simple fact. "We use a state-inspected abattoir for the slaughter. We bring the fresh hams back here. The curing process is done on farm, and we sell direct to consumers. It's an exempt process." Monroe's frown deepened. "Exempt under what regulation?" "USDA Regulation 9 CFR 303.1, Jacob said. "Salt curing for direct-to-consumer sales from the farm of origin. It's been in the code since 1967. You should know it. It's in your book." Monroe was silent. He did know the regulation, though he had never encountered it in practice. It was one of those footnotes in the federal code, a grandfather clause from another era, preserved because salt curing predated the entire modern regulatory apparatus. It was a blind spot in the system he had dedicated his career to enforcing. He looked from Silas to Jacob, then toward the spring house. That old stone building would fail every modern metric for food safety. The porous stone walls, the variable humidity, the lack of precise temperature control, all of it would be violations in any federally inspected facility. And yet it was producing hams that, according to the food writer, whose article Monroe had actually read, were among the finest in America. There were no surfaces to cite for porosity, no temperature logs to demand, no procedural violations to document. The system he represented had no jurisdiction here. There was nothing for him to do, no box to check, no form to fill out. For a man who had built his career on the certainty of regulations, it was a strange feeling. "I learned something today," Monroe said finally, his voice quiet. "I learned that sometimes the system has limits, that there are things older than the regulations, and maybe that's okay." He extended his hand to Silas. "I'm sorry about how things went before. I was doing my job, but I should have been more thoughtful about it." Silas shook his hand. "You were doing what you believed was right." "Still," Monroe said, "I wish I'd seen this path back then. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." "Maybe," Silas said, "but maybe I needed the trouble to remember what was important." Monroe nodded. He got back in his car and drove away, raising a hand in farewell as he passed down the gravel drive. After he was gone, Jellis and Jacob stood together in the afternoon light. The air was cool, carrying the first hint of the coming winter. The Berkshires were rooting peacefully in their pen. The spring house sat solid on the hillside, unchanged, patient, eternal. "He said I was stuck in the past," Silas said. "Back when he first came. He was right in a way. Everything I needed was back there. Not in the future they wanted me to chase." Jacob put his hand on his father's shoulder. They stood like that for a moment, two men who had traveled a long road to reach this understanding. The lesson Silas had learned was not that the old ways are always better. The lesson was that the right way is the way that fits the place it inhabits. The USDA system was designed for a world of industrial scale, of placeless commodities, of interchangeable parts moved through standardized processes. It was a good system for that world. It probably prevented countless illnesses and deaths, but it was the wrong system for 284 acres in Greene County, Tennessee, for a spring that ran at 52 degrees year-round, for a family that had worked this specific soil for 130 years. Silas Blackwood's victory was not in proving the government wrong. It was in proving that another way was still possible. He had not built a smaller version of their system. He had not tried to compete on their terms. He had remembered something older, something that predated the entire modern apparatus of regulation and control. A system based not on electricity and stainless steel, but on salt and patience. A system based not on debt and expansion, but on inheritance and limits. A system that required deep knowledge of a specific place, knowledge that could not be written in a manual or taught in a classroom. What survives, Silas understood now, is not always what is biggest or newest or most compliant with the latest regulations. What survives is what knows its own ground. The rigid breaks, the rooted adapts, and in adapting endures. The $14.75 padlock still hangs on the door of the old butcher shop, 7 years of rain and weather having turned it rusty and orange. Silas walks past it every day. He has never removed it, never even touched it since the day Monroe installed it. It sits there as a reminder of the day the government came with good intentions and perfect certainty and tried to save him from himself. And in doing so, in closing that door, they had inadvertently pointed him toward another one. The spring still runs constant in true 52 degrees pulled from deep within the Tennessee hills. In the cool darkness of the stone house that Thomas Blackwood built in 1888, new hams hang from the century-old hooks undergoing their slow transformation from raw meat to something transcendent. The work continues year after year, following the rhythm of seasons and the patient art of salt and time. Jacob has learned to feel the quality of a ham by its weight, by the sound it makes when tapped by subtle signs that have no names but which his hands now understand. He is teaching his own daughter, who is 9 years old and already knows the difference between a good cure and a great one. The farm will pass to her one day. The spring house, the iron hooks, the knowledge. The Blackwood name, which almost died with a padlock in April of 2011, has found new life. Not through expansion or modernization or compliance with federal regulations, but through a return to something essential. Through remembering that some things cannot be scaled, cannot be sold, cannot be separated from the ground that produces them. On quiet evenings when the work is done and the sun is setting over the pasture, Silas sometimes walks up to the spring house and stands inside for a few moments. He listens to the constant sound of water flowing through the channel his great-grandfather carved. He breathes the cool air that smells of stone and earth and time. He thinks about his grandfather standing in the same spot hanging hams from these same hooks, saying the salt has to win. And he understands now that the salt is not the only thing that has to win. What has to win is the knowledge of how to use it, the patience to wait, the humility to recognize that some things cannot be rushed or improved or made more efficient. What has to win is the willingness to say no to debt, to scale, to the seductive logic of more. What has to win is the courage to remember who you are and where you come from, even when the whole weight of the modern world is telling you to become something else. The salt always wins, his grandfather had said, here in this place with these hands following this knowledge. And 70 years later, standing in the same cool darkness, Silas knows it is true.